Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. So let me give you a little bit of a sense of what I hope that we can engage on for the next few minutes, at least 30 minutes or so. So I would like to try to focus on what I would consider to be the social and cultural dimensions of the innovation ecosystem. That really, if you were to ask me, what are the dimensions that I would like to look at? So I'm going to start by pointing your attention to a report that is a 2012 report. I'll make a few remarks, and then I'll get into what I consider to be some of the research related to social cultural dimensions that will have a significant impact on innovation in the next couple of decades, and I hope that I'm right about that. So the document that I'm going to use as a context for my remarks is a report from the National Research Council, and I just want to, if I could just. So the National Research Council in the U.S., some of you may be familiar with the National Research Council. It includes the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute for Medicine. But in its 2012 report, it's called Rising to the Challenge, U.S. Innovation Policy for the Global Economy. And in my opinion, the academies, as in usual style, do a very good job of looking at some of the global dimensions of technology, science and technology, and sort of where the United States falls in regard to some of that global competitiveness. So I'm going to mention just a few items here. It's a fairly extensive report, and I'm doing this mostly as a context for a few remarks that I would like to make about research in 4 areas. So if you look at sort of where the U.S. views sort of what it must be doing, what it must do in order to enhance innovation. So one of the items that's on this list is monitor and evaluate basically various models of innovation. Monitor and evaluate investments, measures, and innovation policies of other nations. Now, some of that has been done certainly over the last day or so in terms of trying to look at innovation policies of various countries. I want to return to that issue because we talk about case studies in innovation and best practices or effective practices in innovation. My own feeling is that we probably could do a better job, a much better job of trying to understand these case studies. And so in this report, of course, a number of different nations are indicated and some of their practices. But, you know, this issue of doing sort of, it's almost anthropological work, actually, in terms of doing case studies of innovation. So that's certainly an area that I think not only the U.S. can do much better on that, but I think more globally. Another being enhance the traditional pillars of U.S. economic strength and innovation. You know, U.S. economic strength and innovation is built on a number of pillars, and certainly one of those being R&D, the kind of investments that have been made in research and development. So this whole notion of sort of how to strengthen that particular dimension. The university system in the United States, certainly the U.S. has some of the stronger university centers in the world, and that's certainly viewed as a pillar of success for the United States. So it goes on with a number of different recommendations. I'm particularly interested in things like building a 21st century innovation infrastructure. And what does that mean to have a 21st century infrastructure in terms of the kind of communication networks that are important and so forth. So one of a dimension that I feel has been tremendously neglected in this report, and I do hope that some of you will read it and even send messages to me, since I have some linkages to the National Research Council. I would love to be able to see what do people outside of the U.S. think about the kinds of recommendations that the National Research Council is making regarding the future of innovation in the U.S. So this dimension that we often look at things that can be fairly easily quantified, but that there are dimensions that are not easy to quantify, and those social and cultural dimensions of innovation often do not get the kind of attention, at least in my opinion, that they should get. So there are 4 areas of research that I suggest are important to keep one's eyes on in the future. They have heavy social and cultural dimensions. That innovation doesn't just occur in a vacuum, but innovation occurs with real people in real places that have real governments, that have real businesses, etc. And the change can be rather complex. The whole notion of innovation is a very complex notion, cutting across a whole bunch of different areas. So we're trying to look at, let's see, so I particularly feel that the nature of the interactions that exist between the various players need to be examined much more carefully. We talk about higher education institutions. They differ, of course, in many ways. Research institutes, research parks, business, industry, government, what's the nature of relationship between these various entities? Not only within these entities within a particular region of a country, but across the world, for example. What's the nature of the interactions among these kinds of entities? So, 4 areas that I will take a moment to say a bit about as regards to past, current, and future research. One being in the area of what I would describe as innovation studies. There are people who have for some time been doing work related to innovation. Let me just take a moment to mention that in the U.S., and I know in some other countries, I would love to know more about some of the programs in other countries. There have been science and technology type policy type programs for some time. I want to mention a few of them, because there are those of us that have been concerned for a long time about issues of innovation, about issues of national and global policies related to science and engineering. So let me just mention some of these programs in the U.S. Carnegie Mellon has a program called Engineering and Public Policy, and that program has been around for about 35 years, I believe. Granger Morgan founded the program, a physicist, founded the program. MIT has a program called Technology Management and Policy. Stanford has Management, Science, and Engineering. And, at Stony Brook University, our own program within my Department of Technology and Society is called Technology, Policy, and Innovation. The Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands has a program, Technology, Policy, and Management. So all of these programs are sort of approaches to trying to understand something about issues of technology, policy, innovation in their context, or within the various contexts, whether it's within a U.S. context or within broader context. I'm very interested, by the way, over the last day or so, I've had the opportunity to have many discussions with various people, and I'm interested for a whole bunch of reasons. Potentially to do some type of comparative research related to innovation. I hope that with Korea, for example, now we have SUNY Korea, State University of New York, Stony Brook offers programs in Korea. I expect that we will do collaborative research. I would hope that part of that collaborative research would be in the area of technology management and technology policy and innovation. I would encourage such kind of research. We're doing lots of work. We've heard a lot about the kinds of projects and activities that are going on, it would be nice to look at opportunities for collaborations, and I believe I've struck up at least a couple of opportunities while I've been here over the last few days. I'm particularly interested, again, in parts of the world that are more developing countries, where maybe much of the research related to innovation studies, where there hasn't been as much attention given to innovation occurring in certain kinds of developing countries. Decision making is another item. It has a fairly extensive history in terms of personal decision making, organizational decision making, etc. There's a notion that is fairly new, I will return to it, called cultural cognition. And this work comes largely out of the Yale Law School, and that is that the worldview that people bring to situations have lots of implications for their views towards various policies. And those worldviews, as one might expect, are not easy things to change. And so this issue about collaboration among various entities, whether they be higher education institutions, business, industry, government, or whatever, these notions of worldview that people bring can have significant implications. And the fourth area that I indicate, that I think research in this area will have some substantial implications, is what an area called global studies. And basically global studies is very problem-oriented. The idea being that you start with an issue that you're trying to resolve, and you tackle that problem from transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transgeographical boundaries, etc. So this sort of notion of global studies. So let me just say a few things about these various areas. And my paper tries to go into some detail in the various areas. So I would like to kind of think that I'm trying to point you in a direction. That the focus of my presentation today is to say, here are a couple of things that I think are important for people who are looking at innovation to think about. One being, I started with a document, a report. I think it's worthy of a reaction to the report. It's worth reading. It's worth seeing how the U.S. views the rest of the world, whether they got it right, whether the National Research Council got it right in certain areas, whether they perhaps were wrong in a number of other areas. But it's a view in terms of sort of innovation worldwide, technological innovation, and where it appears from the point of view of the National Research Council that technological innovation is going. So people have looked at various notions of innovation, conceptual frameworks for thinking about innovation, the triple helix model. I heard that word thrown around. In fact, just Monday, I was in a meeting on Asian triple helix society. So I know that this notion of university, government, business kind of collaborations, and I would even extend that to the population. So these notions of sort of schools of innovation. I'm not going to go into any real detail about this, but just to point out that there is a body of knowledge related to innovation, sort of what kind of innovation, sort of corporate models, corporate sort of capability school of economic development, entrepreneurship school, and sort of cultural school, cultural perspective of innovation development. And there are people who study very much innovation from these different types of directions. In the triple helix model, this suggests that there are various ways in which the various entities might interact, and you might want to think about various countries and where your country falls in regard to these various models in the triple helix in terms of sort of what's described as a statist kind of model where business and industry, academia function more under the state. A separatist type of model where these entities function pretty much independently, and this sort of layered model where one's looking at the interaction between the various parties. And in my opinion, on this interaction element, that's been one of the areas that we probably have not treated as seriously as we should treat. So in this model, these issues about components, relationships, functions, etc., and how these entities tie together, these are subjects for studies. And so some of you that are involved in some of the sort of innovation kind of work may want to look at sort of what are these relationships? What fosters certain kind of innovation, etc. So just pointing out, this is taken from Marina Ranger and Henry Etzkowitz. Some of you will know the name Henry Etzkowitz, who, and in fact, I guess he spent some time at Stanford. He was in our department for a few years, and I think that he also did some work out of Stanford. But as I see where triple helix is going now, it's really looking in a more detailed way at relationship, not just that these are separate entities, but the kinds of relationship that exist between the entities is very important. The whole notion of decision making, there is a fairly extensive body of knowledge I pointed out related to everywhere ranging from individual decision making to organizational decision making, etc. And when you're trying to make decisions that cut across the various organizations, some of this work I think can be of value to people. Some of you will be aware of the work of Kahneman and Tversky. Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics, largely from looking at these issues of System 1, System 2 kind of thinking that people do, System 1 being automatic, System 2 being more deliberate, etc. So this whole notion of psychology of judgment and decision making and the kinds of biases that people have in regard to decision problems is something worth looking at. Negotiation. There's a body of knowledge there in negotiation. I'm not going to spend time on this stuff. Mostly this stuff is related to notions of relationship, again, in terms of sort of integrating various modalities in a purpose-driven kind of approach, where one might feel that the relationship is more one that is adversarial. I want to mention just a little bit about this notion of cultural cognition. I happen to think is one of the more sort of interesting notions. And that is that if one measures individuals on various dimensions, like individualistic versus more communal, okay, for example, or egalitarian versus hierarchical, etc., one can, on the basis of that, and this is something that can be measured, one can, on the basis of that, predict the individual's attitude towards a number of policy decisions. So it turns out this notion of worldview, sort of a cultural kind of notion, this notion of worldview can be measured and can be shown to have significant implications for how people feel about things like climate change, for example. And so when one's communicating and establishing collaborations across culture, these notions about worldview, these are very important notions. I make reference to a couple of papers in my paper that are pay-in papers dealing with cultural cognition and their relevance to things like different populations' beliefs about climate change, gun control, you name it, a whole bunch of things that can be predicted based on this notion of cultural cognition. A fourth area that I will mention here is an area called global studies. And again, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but it's a very problem-solving oriented kind of approach. The idea being that rather than take problem solving from the direction of a discipline or even from the direction of a country, how does one try to transcend those barriers and approach problems in a much more global way? Some of that work probably is going on at my own university, Stony Brook University, and I actually cite Brook, who is a historian at Stony Brook, in my paper, and have a little dialogue with him in my paper. This means involving not only scientists and engineers, but historians, anthropologists, political scientists, etc., in this whole notion of trying to understand innovation within multiple cultural, social contexts. So let me just try to wrap up on a couple of things. So part of the idea is that many of the dimensions of innovation have strong social and cultural dimensions associated with them. And those dimensions might be the most complex to address. To sense the needs of various societies, and to situate innovation within that complex web of cultural activity may be one of the more challenging activities as we go forward on innovation. So let me just try to point you to a couple of reports, one that I've mentioned already, and just to mention some of the social and cultural dimensions that are intertwined in these reports. Understanding Research, Science, and Technology Parks, Global Best Practices. This is a National Research Council report from 2009. And if you look at the kinds of things that they recommend, there's heavy issue about cultural, government, etc., relationship issues that appear as a part of these recommendations, for example, that you need champions, committed champions who match sustained high-level attention with significant support for the growth and development of a research park. Leadership, effective leadership, and professional management. Well, what does that mean? What's effective leadership in particular contexts? That leadership is not in isolation. That leadership is in relationship to government. That leadership is in relationship to business practices. That leadership is in relationship to a whole bunch of things. And my position is that trying to deal with that complexity requires an understanding that goes beyond some of the things that are easily measured. Funding, quite a bit has been said about that. Bridging institutions, and they also talk about something called soft infrastructure. I find that rather interesting. This term captures the positive human capital built over many years of public investment in education, etc., etc. When I look at Korea, and I don't know if the Koreans would agree with me on this, but I certainly feel like a lot of Korea's innovation and progress over the last 50 years has been a result of that kind of strong investment in the soft infrastructure. And those things may be hidden, and they may not be the most apparent thing to people and outsiders looking in. To people within a country, it may be very apparent. There was some discussion at lunch today about education, etc., and its relationship to various outcomes, but it may not be so apparent to others. Metrics, effective metrics to help manage, management set clear goals and over time gauge the effectiveness of research entities. This notion of metrics came up in Professor Richard Dash's talk this morning. These notions about how do you measure, especially some of these dimensions that are on the social and the cultural side. So I'll just mention sort of a few of the items from the report. Rising to the Challenge, U.S. Innovation Policies for the Global Economy. If you ask sort of what are new trends in global innovation, probably I'd be curious if you have items you'd like to add to that. I'm going to write for the National Research Council my reaction to the report. But anyway, if you look at some of the dimensions, one of them being strong policy focus on innovation. And by the way, from U.S. perspective, sometimes it's not very clear what that means, because I'm not sure the U.S. has a policy on innovation. in the sense in which some countries would say they have innovation policy. I'm not sure there is a U.S. innovation policy. It's a very distributed kind of innovation, innovation is very distributed. Yes, there are government policies that attempt to enable certain things, tax incentives for certain reasons, even New York State at a state level and local level. There are various incentives that government comes up with to try to spearhead innovation, but is there a national innovation policy? Not sure. Some would say that's a good thing, and some would say that's creating some problem for U.S. competitiveness at this point. Certainly the rapid growth in research and development spending. By the way, the social dimensions of things like research and dimensions, I think, are pretty obvious. Is that I was also having a discussion with someone earlier about high risk, high gain, the notion of innovation, and that you don't expect to win all of the time. And sometimes the public tends to think that you're supposed to win. I served on a panel of the National Science Foundation, and the title of the committee, I spent a month in Washington. Now I started calculating how much time I spent in Washington. I was spending a lot of time in Washington, and I served on a panel called Applications of Advanced Technology. And when proposals came to us, they were supposed to be high risk, high gain. And that is, we expected only a small percent of the things that were funded to work. So when we would get proposals where it was obvious that something could be done, the red light would go on for us and we would say, wrong program. Good idea, but wrong program. Because our program is supposed to be high risk. So we would ship the proposal to another area of the foundation to say, this is worth funding. It ought to be done, it has value, but it's not an appropriate project for our program. We felt that in our program, if 10% of the things that we funded yielded extensively positive results, we considered our program to be successful. And this kind of thing, by the way, can be very difficult to communicate to the public. It can be very difficult within certain national contexts, in certain countries. It can be very difficult to communicate that kind of message, that innovation is often high risk. And I think this also was a topic that you discussed. And what are people's attitudes towards risk? What are the penalties for failing? If you fail, does that mean you're out of a job? Or is failing considered to be a natural part of the innovation process? Okay. So that's part of the social sort of cultural dimension, I think. 21st century was called mercantilism and sort of markets and how they come about and access to markets, etc. Certainly the search for talent is a global search. The search is on for talent, and the factors that allow one to attract talent of various types depends on a whole bunch of things. This growth of foreign research centers, not just of U.S. multinationals, but the growth of foreign research centers, period. I believe, I read recently that Samsung had formed some type of software center in Silicon Valley. Is that? Okay.
Hired about 1,100 people.
What's that?
Hired about 1,100.
Hired about 1,100 people. So this notion of sort of this distributed notion, you talk about open innovation, and this notion of sort of what gets pushed out and what gets brought in order to facilitate innovation is something kind of, so the rise sort of open innovation and certainly the growth of innovation regions around the world. I will close pretty much with this notion of sort of emerging industries. I think none of these will come as any big surprise for you. I'm involved in a major project at this moment on at least a major proposal. Who knows whether it's going to turn into a project or not, but a major proposal on advanced batteries. The issue is that one looks at alternative energy and storage, etc. The being able to do electrochemical storage much better is extremely important, and certainly the whole pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industry. So let me just try to conclude with just a couple of remarks. I guess the bottom line is that I would like to try to think that when we view various innovation policies, that we view those policies in social and cultural contexts. So if I have a message for the National Research Council, I guess my message would be, I think they got it right on a lot of the elements in terms of what the U.S. needs to do in order to move forward on innovation. I think that probably they did not make as much use as they should have of work related to the social and the cultural dimension, that these things don't just get done. No matter whether you're talking about increases in R&D funding or whatever, there are bloody battles that are fought at almost every turn on the kinds of items that I've been talking about. And understanding the kind of social, cultural cognition, decision-making, that mix of things can have significant implications for the kind of policies that get developed. So thank you for taking a moment to listen to my